Hi, I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and I'm going to show you how to make this elephant block. It's an applique pattern that is the current pattern in the Funny Faces Quilt Block of the Month Club. And when I say current, it is January 15th, 2021. So this is the first pattern in 2021 in the Funny Faces Club. The pattern will be exclusive to the Funny Faces Club until February 15th, 2021, at which point there will be a new block in the club, and then this one will be available just in the regular shop at Shiny Happy World, probably sometime or like the first week in March. So that is a quick where you find the pattern. Now I'm going to give you just a super quick overview of how I do my applique. I use a couple of different techniques. One is I use fusible adhesive for my applique, and I also do quilt as you go. So if you look more closely at the block, here's just kind of a nutshell version. I quilt the background block to the batting. So on this, you can see I don't have a backing on it yet. That's different from most people's quilt as you go methods. I quilt the background fabric to the batting, and then I applique on top of that, so I don't have to quilt around the animal that I'm doing. And then I do all of the outline stitching on the animal. So all of my stitching where I'm making a lot of turns and spinning my work around a lot in the machine, all of that is done when I'm working with just a single block. Then I trim the block down to size, which I haven't done on this one yet. So all the blocks in my quilt together, press those seams open. I'm using a cotton batting, so it's a thin batting, and you really don't get, you would think you would get a lot of additional bulk at the seams, but you just don't. Press those seams open. Then I add the backing, and I quilt the front of the quilt to the back of the quilt, just doing stitch in the ditch along those seam lines that join those blocks together. So the only time that I'm working the entire mass of the quilt through the machine is that final bit where I'm attaching the backing, and I'm only doing straight lines. So that is very easy to run through any domestic sewing machine, and it takes, for a nap size quilt, which is what I use on the couch, it takes about a half an hour to do that straight line quilting to attach the backing, and I can handle working the entire mass of my quilt through a machine for 30 minutes, but I really don't want to do it for longer than that, and I definitely don't want to do it when I have to do any kind of tight turns. So that's a nutshell version of how I do quilt as you go. Now we're going to get into how I do this particular block. Okay, the first thing you need to do is print out your pattern. The elephant prints out just on a single sheet. You can print it out on regular paper and then trace it onto the paper side of paper-backed fusible adhesive. It's already been reversed. Or if you're like me and you don't like to trace, you can print it directly onto printable fusible adhesive. This is the brand that I like. People always ask. It's the Heat & Bond Easy Print Lightweight. Lightweight is the one that does great through the washer and dryer. Just print it onto the paper side of the adhesive, and then you're going to roughly cut out each piece. And when I say roughly cut, I mean don't cut it right on the lines. You're going to leave a little bit of white space around all the lines. And here is an example of one of those pieces. Ignore the fact that this is a dashed line. That was just my inkjet printer being fussy with me. So you're going to cut it out a little bit around the solid lines. For now, just ignore the dotted lines. We'll get to them in a minute. And then fuse it to the wrong side of your fabric. This is a batik that I'm using for this one, and there is no right side and wrong side to batiks. But for your fabrics, if you're not using a batik, make sure you fuse it to the wrong side of the fabric. So here is a list of your pieces. So the elephant ear I did in a slightly lighter gray than the rest of the body. So I've got the shoulders and then the head, and those are all done in a darker gray. And then I've got a couple of water drops that are going to come out of her trunk, and I just did those on a light blue batik. So once you get all the pieces fused, then we're going to go on to the next step. Okay, the next step is what I call the clean cut. And it's important that you do a rough cut first, fuse it in place, and then do your final cut, because what that does is it makes sure that the adhesive goes all the way to the edge of your cut pieces. So right now, if this was the clean cut, if I had clean cut this, and now I had to go back and cut right along the edge of the paper, I wouldn't get it always right along the edge of the paper. I would miss a couple of threads here and there, and those threads are going to fray very easily. So by doing a rough cut first and then fusing it in place and then doing the clean cut, now I'm actually cutting through the edges that have already been fused, and that means that that fusible adhesive goes all the way to the edges, covering every last thread. So again, you're going to cut on the solid lines. Please ignore the fact that mine is dashed looking. That's just my printer being streaky. You're going to cut on the solid lines. We'll talk in the next video about what we're going to do about these dotted lines. But cut all of your pieces out cleanly, and then in the next video we will talk about marking all of these dotted lines, which are placement lines, which are going to help you put it together really easily. All right, before we peel off the paper and assemble this, we're going to need to transfer these lines from the pattern to the front side of the fabric so that we can use them to help us guide us when we're putting the pieces together. So I use a few different tools for this. The first one that I use is just a fine tip Sharpie, and I use that for any lines that I'm going to just stitch over, and also for anything that I'm going to applique over with solid black, because it doesn't matter if I'm using a black permanent pen, if I'm going to cover it up with black applique that I'm not worried about the line showing through, or if I'm going to stitch over it with black thread. So on this one, the only thing that I'm doing with that is the eye and the eyelashes on this elephant. So if you wanted to make yours not have her eyes closed, you can just use a black oval like I use in most of my other patterns. The rest of the lines, you're going to want to use something erasable. And whenever possible, I use chalk. I just have a white chalk marker that I use. If the fabric is too light for the chalk to show, then I will just use a regular pencil. Nothing fancy. This is just a Ticonderoga pencil. The only thing is that I don't use the eraser that comes on it because it always has a colored eraser. The Ticonderogas have black erasers, but even a pencil that has a red eraser, that can leave a colored smudge on your fabric. So the other tool that I use is just a plain white artist eraser. It doesn't leave any color behind when you erase, and you can use it to erase both the pencil lines and also the chalk lines. So those are my tools for transferring the lines. And I transfer everything else with something erasable. So I've got the marks that show me where the head joins the shoulders and where the ear goes on, marked also here and on the ear. The only thing that doesn't have any transfer lines in this one is the little drops of water. So in the next video, you'll see those markings in action because we're going to do the fun part, and that is putting it together. All right, now it's time for the fun part, and that is putting it all together. So this one, he goes right into the corner, or she. So that's the piece that I'm going to start with. That is the shoulder piece, and it's got this square edges. You wouldn't want that floating out in the middle of the block. That would look like she's been chopped off. We want it to look like a cropped photo. So I'm going to tuck that pretty close into the edge here. Leave just a little bit, but we're going to trim that block later. So next up is the head. And the head overlaps the shoulders. And we can see where it overlaps. So this line tells us where on the head it overlaps, right here. And this one shows how deep it overlaps. So once I line it up in here and I cover up that marking, I've got her head positioned in there. So now I'm just flattening out the trunk. There we go. And now, oops, I shifted that a little bit. There we go. I didn't actually trace these right on the lines. I was pretty sloppy about it. Now we've got the ear, and you could look at this piece and be like, oh my gosh, which direction does that ear go? That's why that line is going to be really helpful to us. So this one shows us where the ear goes, and that's going to give us a rough idea of the shape of the ear. And this line actually shows us where the edge of the head hits underneath the ear, and that really helps us to line that up. So we peel that backing off, and get that. So we cover up the lines that show the placement markings, and we get this line pretty much lined up with the edge of her head. And when we've got that in place, it's in the right place. So now I've just got a couple of drips of water, and it doesn't really matter where these go. You could even skip them if you wanted to, but I'm gonna put one coming right out of her trunk, and then another one, I think, up a little bit higher. So maybe I'll do like they're coming out in a line here. So you can play around with that until you are happy with it. Move all of your pieces around however you need to until you're happy with how it's all laid out. And then I'm gonna take it over to the ironing board and I'm gonna fuse it in place. That's when it's permanent, so make sure you're happy with where all your pieces are. I'm gonna fuse it in place, then I'm gonna do all of the outline stitching, and then I'll bring it back here and walk you through the path I took. This one is actually very, very simple to outline, and I'll show you the finished block. All right, here we are with the finished block. I've done all of the outlining. On this one, the outlining was really simple. I started, first of all, just a reminder, I generally outline everything. I go 3 times around everything, and I'm not trying really hard to get right on top of my previous line of stitching because I wanted to have kind of a sketchbook look to it. So on this one, I started on the ear just inside the head here, and I went around the ear 3 times, once, twice, 3 times. Then I continued past where I started, and then I'm going to go around the head, and I went around once, twice, and 3 times, and then I backtracked here. So I actually did 4 rows of stitching here. You can't tell the difference between 3 and 4 rows, so it's a great way to scooch to another area without having to stop and tie a knot and start again. Then I went at the front of the shoulders, 1, 2, 3, and then I just stitched once up around this edge. This is going to be cropped to fit, and then cropped to size, and then sewn into a seam allowance. So you're never going to see that line of stitching. And then 1, 2, 3, and tied it off. So I did all of the head with just the 1 knot. Then there's nothing for it. The drops of water are just 3 times around, tie it off, same thing here. And for the eyelashes, I started on this side of the lid and went across once, and then back across the lid, and then stopped and did the first eyelash. And on these I did 4 rows of stitching. 1, 2, 3, 4. Continued on the lid until I got to the middle eyelash. 1, 2, 3, 4. Continued on the lid until I got to the far eyelash. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the rest of the way on the lid. And that was 2 passes then total on the lid, and then I just went back and forth 1 more time to make the lid the same thickness as the lashes. And that is it. So that is the elephant block. I'm going to show you just a couple of other color combinations I did. So this one is in the realistic gray. I used the warm neutral batiks for the elephant, and this is the box of crayons fabric bundle for the background, and then this is just a blue batik I used on the water drops. So that one is a pretty realistic gray elephant, which is what African elephants are usually pretty gray in color. And for this one, I did more of an Asian elephant, which are usually more brownish, kind of a reddish brown cinnamon color. So she uses the new Warm Neutrals fabric bundle, not the Warm Neutrals batiks, but the regular Warm Neutrals, and then just a random scrap of blue that I had. And the pale pink for her background is from the Rainbow Sherbet fabric bundle. And then I've got one more, a silly fun one. I love doing some of these fantasy colored animals. And this one I think is my favorite of all of the elephant blocks. So this is just a silly green elephant, and I like to imagine that she's splashing around with some pink lemonade. The dots fabric that I used here and also for the drops is from the dots fabric bundle, and this matching gingham is from Gingham Play. And the dots and the Gingham Play bundles, I've designed them so that they work really well together. So for each shade in dots, there is a corresponding matching shade in the Gingham Play. And then the background is from the Rainbow Batiks fabric bundle. And the batiks make a really nice background, especially if you're not so comfortable with the quilting or you want to be practicing your quilting, because it doesn't show up as much on the rainbow blocks, or I'm sorry, on the batik blocks as it does on the solid blocks. Even when you use matching thread, you get a more clearly defined stitching if you use a solid fabric, where if you use the batik, it tends to blend into all of that dappliness. And that is it. We'll be back next month with a new pattern in the Funny Faces Quilt Block of the Month Club. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World. I'll see you next month.